Most evenings, nothing about the tree seemed remarkable. It stood at the edge of an open field beside a quiet country road, its branches dark against the fading light, its leaves barely moving in the warm breeze. People drove past it every day without slowing down. A farmer crossed the road nearby on his way home. A dog barked somewhere in the distance. The last gold light of the evening settled across the grass, and for a few moments, everything felt exactly as it always had. Then a single swallow appeared. It came low across the field, cutting through the air with effortless precision before landing near the top of the tree. Nothing unusual about that. Swallows landed in trees all the time. But a minute later, another arrived. Then 3 more. Then 10. You might not have noticed it at first. Most people didn't. The change was subtle, almost quiet enough to miss. Yet something about the scene began to feel different. The branches that had seemed empty moments earlier were no longer empty. Tiny silhouettes appeared against the evening sky. Wing beats flickered through the fading sunlight. The air itself seemed to be gathering movement. And then more came. From the north. From the west. From somewhere beyond the distant fields where the horizon had already begun to darken. They arrived in small groups and loose waves, each one settling into the same tree as if following instructions nobody could hear. If you're new here, subscribe before you leave, because what you're about to discover may change the way you look at the birds around you forever. And this is where things began to feel impossible to ignore. Within half an hour, there were not dozens of swallows in the tree, but hundreds. The branches sagged beneath them. The sound of soft chirps drifted through the cooling air. People stopped their cars. Neighbors stepped onto porches. Nobody had called the birds there. Nobody had guided them. And yet they kept coming, as though they were all responding to something hidden just beyond human sight. Maybe you have seen something like this before. Not hundreds of swallows gathering in a single place, but a moment that made you stop for no reason you could explain. A moment that felt ordinary on the surface and strangely important underneath. You were driving home as the sun was going down, sitting on a porch after dinner, looking out a window while the evening settled over the neighborhood. And then something caught your attention, not because it was loud, not because it demanded to be noticed, but because something inside you quietly recognized that it did not belong to the usual rhythm of the day. Most people know that feeling. We experience it more often than we admit. A sudden silence in a room, a distant sound carried by the wind, a flock of birds changing direction all at once. Small things, easy things to dismiss, yet sometimes they linger in the back of your mind long after they are gone. Standing beneath that tree, people described a similar feeling. Not fear, not excitement, something quieter than that. They found themselves watching longer than they intended to. Conversations slowed. Car doors remained open. Even the people who had lived near the tree for years seemed reluctant to look away. The swallows continued arriving as the light faded from gold to blue. Their shapes crossed the sky in quick flashes before disappearing into the growing crowd of birds already perched among the branches. And the strange part was not simply how many there were. It was the sense that every bird seemed to know exactly where it was going. No hesitation, no confusion, just certainty, as though each one had received the same message. As though each one was responding to something invisible that the people standing below could feel but could not quite name. And that is where the questions began. Because the longer they watched, the harder it became to believe they were witnessing something ordinary. The first explanation people usually reach for is a simple one. The tree must be special. Perhaps its branches offer better shelter. Perhaps it stands taller than the others. Perhaps there is something about its shape that attracts birds from miles away. It sounds reasonable. The human mind likes reasons that fit neatly into place. But as the days passed, a few people began paying closer attention. And that is when the ordinary explanation started to feel less complete. The field was not empty except for that tree. There were dozens of others scattered across the landscape. Some were larger, some were denser. A few stood closer to water, others offered even more protection from wind. Yet evening after evening, the swallows ignored them. They crossed over perfectly suitable places and continued toward the same destination. From a distance, you could watch it happening, small groups arriving from different directions, converging toward a single point, as though invisible lines had been drawn across the sky. What made the scene even stranger was the precision. Many birds arrived without circling first. They did not seem to search. They did not appear to compare one tree against another. They flew directly toward their destination with the confidence of travelers returning to a familiar address. If you stood quietly beneath the fading light, you began noticing details that most people would never stop long enough to see. A branch already crowded somehow receiving more arrivals. Birds shifting position without chaos. Tiny movements rippling through the tree like a wave passing through water. The entire gathering seemed organized by rules no human could hear. And this is where the hidden layer begins to emerge. Because what looked at first like hundreds of individual decisions was starting to resemble something else entirely. Something collective. Something shared. As though the birds were participating in a conversation that had started long before the first swallow appeared against the evening sky. What researchers eventually discovered is that gatherings like this are not accidents. Long before the sky grows dark, long before the first stars appear, swallows begin making decisions about where they will spend the night. But what makes that remarkable is not the decision itself. It is the scale. A single swallow weighs less than an ounce. Its brain is tiny. Its life is spent moving through enormous landscapes of fields, rivers, roads, and towns. And yet somehow, hundreds of them can arrive at the same location within a narrow window of time, often within minutes of one another. Scientists call these places communal roosts. The phrase sounds technical, almost ordinary, but standing beneath the branches, there is nothing ordinary about it. Researchers studying swallow behavior have noticed that birds arriving at these evening gatherings are constantly watching one another. Tiny adjustments, quick calls, subtle changes in direction, information flowing through the flock in ways that are almost impossible to see unless you know what you are looking for. One bird shifts course, others follow. A few settle, more arrive. The pattern grows. And slowly, what began as scattered individuals becomes something larger than the sum of its parts. Perhaps that is why the scene feels so strangely familiar. Because humans understand this instinctively, we know what it means to look toward others when we are uncertain, to seek reassurance without words, to move toward places that feel safe even when we cannot fully explain why. The swallows may not be gathering because of mystery. There are practical reasons. Survival, warmth, communication. Yet standing there in the fading blue light, listening to hundreds of soft voices ripple through the leaves above, it becomes difficult to ignore another possibility. That nature has forms of knowing that rarely announce themselves. Forms of knowing that look almost invisible until enough individuals begin responding to them at once. After a few evenings, something unexpected happened. People stopped coming to watch because they were curious. They started coming because they missed it when they did not. The gathering became part of the landscape, part of the rhythm of the day. Around the same time each evening, a few familiar faces would appear near the roadside. A retired couple sitting quietly in folding chairs. A teenager leaning against the bed of a pickup truck. A woman walking her dog a little slower than usual as the sun drifted toward the horizon. Nobody spoke much. There was very little to say. The tree seemed to ask for silence. And in that silence, small details began to matter. The first birds often arrived within minutes of the fading light, touching the upper branches. The leaves would tremble before anyone noticed why. A quick shadow, a brief flutter. Then another. Some evenings the sky glowed orange behind them. Other evenings it turned silver and pale blue. But the pattern remained, night after night, week after week. People began recognizing individual moments the way you recognize familiar passages in a favorite song. The sudden ripple moving through the flock. The soft wave of chirping that rose and fell across the branches. The way the birds shifted closer together as darkness approached. And slowly, without realizing it, those watching became part of the story too. They started looking up when they arrived. They noticed when the first swallow appeared. They felt the absence on evenings when weather delayed the gathering. It was never dramatic. That is what made it powerful. A connection formed through repetition, through attention, through the simple act of returning. And perhaps that is why the scene lingered in people's minds long after they drove away. Because somewhere between the birds arriving and the daylight fading, the gathering had stopped feeling like an event. It had started feeling like a conversation. Then something began to emerge that nobody noticed at first because it was scattered across months rather than days. The people who returned regularly started comparing memories. A conversation here, an observation there. Small pieces that did not seem important on their own. Yet when placed together, they formed a pattern that was difficult to ignore. There were evenings when the gathering seemed larger than usual, the branches filled earlier. The air above the field became crowded with movement long before sunset. And more than once, those evenings were followed by sudden changes in the weather. A strong front moving through overnight, a stretch of unusually cold air, heavy rain arriving before dawn. Nobody claimed the birds were predicting the future. Most people were careful about that, but they could not help noticing the timing. Researchers have long known that birds can detect changes in atmospheric pressure that humans rarely perceive. Tiny shifts in the air, subtle environmental signals, conditions changing far beyond the horizon, yet standing beneath that tree, the scientific explanation seemed to create a new mystery rather than solve the old one. Because if hundreds of swallows were responding to signals invisible to the people below, what else might they be sensing every day without us realizing it? The thought lingered. Not because it was dramatic, because it felt strangely familiar. Most of us have experienced moments when something felt different before we could explain why. A quiet feeling, a hesitation, a certainty arriving before evidence. Standing there as evening settled across the field, it became difficult not to wonder whether intuition works the same way throughout the natural world. Not as magic, not as prophecy, but as attention operating beneath conscious awareness. And this is where the story became larger than a single tree. Because the more people watched the birds, the more they found themselves asking a question that had nothing to do with birds at all. Years ago, before weather maps refreshed every hour and forecasts appeared instantly on glowing screens, people paid attention to the living world around them. They watched the sky, the wind, the insects, and the birds. Not because they believed nature was magical, but because experience taught them that patterns often appeared before explanations did. Standing beside the roadside now, watching hundreds of swallows settle into the fading evening light, it is easy to understand why those observations endured for generations. Many people believe that animals remain connected to something humans have gradually learned to ignore. Not a supernatural force. Not a hidden message from another world. Something quieter than that. A constant awareness of subtle signals flowing through the environment every moment of every day. Something about this feels difficult to ignore when you watch the flock long enough. The birds do not appear anxious. They do not appear confused. They arrive with a calm certainty that seems almost impossible given the scale of the gathering. One by one. Then dozens at a time. Then so many that the branches seem woven together by feathers and movement. Below them, people stand in silence. Above them, the sky slowly darkens. And for a few moments, both groups share the same space while experiencing it in completely different ways. The birds seem to know exactly what they are doing. The humans are left wondering why. Perhaps that is where the deeper meaning lives. Not in the answer itself, but in the feeling the scene creates. The reminder that intelligence can take forms we do not immediately recognize. That awareness may exist long before language explains it. And that some mysteries remain powerful precisely because they never demand belief. They simply invite attention. Yet the most remarkable part of this story was still waiting to reveal itself. Hidden not in the birds, but in the people who kept returning to watch them. By late summer, the gathering no longer felt like something people came to investigate. It felt like something they came to sit with. The questions were still there. Of course. Why this place? Why this pattern? Why these evenings? But the urgency of finding answers had begun to soften. As the sun lowered beyond the fields and the first shadows stretched across the grass, people arrived carrying less curiosity and more familiarity. They stood quietly near the roadside. Some folded their arms against the cooling air. Others rested their hands on weathered fence posts, worn smooth by years of use. Above them, the birds settled into their familiar rhythm. The sound was gentle, thousands of tiny movements blending into something almost like rain falling far away. The leaves shifted, the branches swayed. The sky deepened from gold to blue and then from blue to that brief color that exists only between day and night. In those moments, the tree seemed less like an object and more like a meeting place, not only for the birds, but for the people who returned again and again without fully understanding why. Something about the scene encouraged stillness. The kind of stillness that has become increasingly rare. No notifications, no schedules, no need to rush toward the next thing. Just a quiet field, a darkening sky, and hundreds of small lives gathering together as they had done countless evenings before. And perhaps that was the realization waiting beneath the mystery all along. Not that the birds possessed secret knowledge. Not that the gathering was supernatural, but that paying attention changes us. The longer people watched, the more they noticed. The more they noticed, the more connected they felt to a world that had been there the entire time. As darkness slowly settled over the landscape, nobody seemed eager to leave. It was as though something important was ending each night and beginning at the same time. And then, one evening, they were gone. Not gradually, not one by one, simply gone. The field was still there. The road was still there. The same wind moved through the same leaves. The same branches stretched into the evening sky. But the voices that had filled the air for weeks had vanished. People still slowed their cars as they passed. Some still glanced toward the familiar silhouette standing at the edge of the field. Out of habit, perhaps. Or maybe because something in them expected to see the gathering again. The tree looked larger now, emptier, more ordinary, yet somehow more meaningful than before. Because once you have witnessed something enough times, it leaves a shape behind even after it is gone. The remarkable thing was never that hundreds of birds gathered there. Nature is filled with behaviors science can explain. Patterns emerge. Instinct guides movement. Life follows rhythms older than memory. The remarkable thing was what happened to the people who stopped long enough to notice. For a few minutes each evening, they stepped outside the noise of their routines and paid attention to something larger than themselves. And in doing so, they were reminded of a truth that is easy to forget. The world is full of conversations happening without words. Signals moving through air, through weather, through instinct, through life itself. Most of them pass unnoticed. But not all. Maybe the birds were responding to changes in the environment. Maybe they were following ancient patterns written deep within them. Or maybe what mattered most was simply the reminder that awareness exists in more forms than we understand. Thank you for staying until the very end of this journey. If you enjoy stories like this, subscribe before you leave, because there are still countless things happening all around us that most people have never truly stopped to see. And perhaps the next one is waiting just beyond your window. Somewhere out there tonight, a quiet field is settling into darkness. A tree is standing beneath the stars. And something small and feathered may already be listening to a world the rest of us are only beginning to notice. Maybe it was only a tree, but it never felt like only a tree.